From the silent, cool observation deck of the orbital post, designated Velisk Watch Station 7, Xylar monitored the planet below. Xylar wasn't male or female in the human sense. The Velisk were a species that had long ago deemed such biological distinctions inefficient. What mattered was function, and Xylar's function was that of a Zen sociologist, a scientist who studied alien cultures. The Velisk prized logic above all else. Their society was built on pure reason, complex data analysis, and the complete suppression of messy, distracting things like feelings. Emotions to the Velisk were biochemical signal noise, useless surges of chemicals that clouded judgment and hindered productive thought. Millennia ago, they had developed mental disciplines and technological aids to dampen and eventually eliminate these primitive responses within themselves. Now, they viewed other species through this lens of pure logic. Below, on the surface of the planet designated PX-47b, lay the fledgling human colony, known simply as Haven. It wasn't much of a haven right now. 3 weeks ago, a sudden, unpredicted meteor shower had pummeled the small settlement. Buildings were smashed, infrastructure damaged, and lives were lost. Xylar had been assigned to observe Haven before the disaster, studying early human colony formation. Now, the focus shifted to observing their response to catastrophic loss. Through high-resolution drone feeds displayed on smooth, dark screens, Xylar watched the humans. Their behaviors were, from a Velisk perspective, bafflingly inefficient. Small groups gathered near collapsed structures, not salvaging usable materials, but simply standing, sometimes holding each other, their bodies shaking with what Xylar's database identified as grief responses. Water leaked from their eyes, crying, a pointless expulsion of vital fluids. They conducted vigils, holding lights and staying awake during optimal rest periods, further reducing their efficiency. Xylar meticulously logged these observations. Subject Group 7b. The Velisk dictated mentally to the recording system, its internal voice devoid of inflection. Engaged in communal vocalizations categorized as lamentations. Energy expenditure, high. Practical outcome, negligible. Resources diverted from shelter repair and resource acquisition. Another feed showed a human carefully digging through the grey dust and twisted metal of a destroyed home. Not for tools or preserved food, Xylar noted, but for scorched photographs and broken ornaments, items with zero practical value. Subject H45, Xylar logged, prioritizing retrieval of objects associated with sentimental value. This aligns with documented primitive attachment behaviors, detrimental to efficient debris processing and resource management. To Xylar, Haven was a case study in flawed biological programming. The humans were clearly intelligent. They had achieved space travel, after all. But they seemed hopelessly enslaved by their emotional responses. Their grief, their attachments, their rituals, all seemed like massive wastes of time and energy in a situation demanding peak efficiency for survival. A logical species would have calculated loss probabilities, allocated resources based on survival needs, and proceeded with rebuilding in emotionless, coordinated work units. These humans were floundering in a sea of unproductive feelings. Xylar predicted a slow recovery for Haven, hampered by these maladaptive stress responses, perhaps even societal collapse if the inefficiencies continued. The Velisk archives contained examples of species that failed to overcome trauma due to similar emotional handicaps. The observer adjusted one of the drone feeds, zooming in on a larger group working near what used to be the colony's central plaza. They were clearing rubble, but their methods seemed disorganized. They weren't systematically creating clear pathways or sorting materials by type for recycling. Instead, they were piling certain kinds of debris, brightly colored plastic shards, strangely twisted pieces of metal, chunks of painted wall, into separate, seemingly random heaps. Observation log addendum, Xylar noted. Group C Alpha exhibits poor coordination in debris removal. Lack of systematic sorting suggests failure to apply basic engineering principles under stress. Further monitoring required to quantify inefficiency levels. Xyla settled in for continued observation, anticipating more data confirming the detrimental effects of human emotion. The VLISC prepared to document precisely how these illogical behaviors would hinder the colony's fight for survival. The patterns were clear, the conclusion logical. Emotions were a fatal flaw in the face of true adversity. Xyla continued the methodical observation of Haven, expecting the inefficiencies to multiply. Logical projections indicated that grief-driven disorganization should lead to resource conflicts, duplicated efforts, and a general decline in collaborative function. But the data coming back from the surface drones started presenting anomalies. The group clearing the central plaza, designated C Alpha, continued their seemingly haphazard work. Yet patterns began to emerge that Xyla's analytical mind couldn't dismiss as mere randomness. The piles of debris they gathered weren't just random junk. One pile grew with shards of colored glass and plastic sorted by hue. Another accumulated twisted metal pieces, chosen not for structural integrity, but for interesting shapes. A third pile consisted of flat, relatively intact pieces of plasteel wall paneling, even if they were scorched or cracked. Revising assessment of Group C Alpha, Xyla logged mentally. Debris sorting criteria deviate from optimal material utility. Correlation analysis suggests sorting based on aesthetic properties, color, form, texture. Purpose remains unclear. Potential link to previously observed sentimental value prioritization? This was illogical. Aesthetic value contributed nothing to survival metrics. It was inefficient. Then, the construction began. But it wasn't the construction of shelters or water purifiers, which logic dictated should be top priority. Using the collected wall panels as a canvas, several humans began applying pigments salvaged from ruined stores. A vast image started to take shape on the wall, a mural. It depicted chaotic streaks of fire falling from the sky, hitting stylized representations of Haven's buildings. But it also showed figures, human shapes, some reaching towards the sky, others helping each other rise from the rubble. Xyla classified this activity, Spontaneous Communal Pigment Application Project. The initial assessment remained. Inefficient use of labor and resources diverts personnel from critical infrastructure repair. Yet Xyla couldn't help but note the level of cooperation involved. Individuals shared scarce pigments. They seemed to coordinate the design without overt leadership, communicating through gestures and short phrases. There was a focused energy to it that contradicted the earlier observations of grief-induced lethargy. Elsewhere, other strange activities unfolded. Near the wreckage of a hydroponics dome, a man sat welding pieces of twisted metal together. Not patching pipes or reinforcing structures, but creating a complex abstract shape that vaguely resembled a flowering plant reaching towards the sky. Others occasionally brought him specific pieces of scrap they found, adding to his collection. Xyla labeled it non-functional metal assemblage creation. Resource cost, significant energy for welder, valuable metal scrap removed from recycling pool. As the colony's single sun began to set, casting long shadows across the debris fields, humans gathered around small fires. They shared meager rations. But then, something else happened. A woman began to sing. Her voice was untrained, filled with sorrow, yet strangely melodic. The song spoke of loss, of fear, but also of endurance. Others fell silent, listening. Then, someone added a harmony. Another person started tapping a rhythm on a salvaged container. Soon, a mournful but powerful music filled the twilight air. Following the music, people began sharing stories, not just data reports of damage, but personal accounts of survival, memories of those lost, even moments of unexpected kindness during the chaos. Xyla's processors worked, trying to fit this into existing VLISC models. communal sonic emission, and oral narrative sharing. It resembled primitive tribal rituals documented in Velisk historical archives, behaviors supposedly abandoned by intelligent species in favor of efficient data exchange. Possible function? Group cohesion ritual? Stress reduction through shared vocalization? Zyla noted. Efficiency impact? Negative. Reduced rest period, focus diverted from strategic planning. But doubt, an unfamiliar and illogical sensation, flickered within Zyla's consciousness. The sheer scale of these activities was perplexing. It wasn't just one or two individuals engaging in irrational behavior. It was widespread, collaborative, and seemed purposeful, even if the purpose defied Velisk logic. The art wasn't just happening. It was being made, together. The songs weren't just cries. They had structure, shared rhythm, harmony. Could this widespread signal noise have a function Zyla wasn't programmed to recognize? The Velisk valued data, and the data was showing coordinated, complex behavior centered around non-utilitarian creation. It was inefficient, yes. Illogical, certainly. But it was also undeniably happening, and Zyla was compelled by Velisk principles to analyze all data, even the seemingly irrational kind. A new analytical category began to form in Zyla's mind, beyond simple inefficiency. Systematic, non-utilitarian communal creation response. The implications were disturbingly unclear. Compelled by the persistent organized nature of the human's creative activities, Zyla delved into the vast Velisk central archives. Accessing millennia of sociological data from countless observed species, Zyla searched for precedents, for logical frameworks that could explain this systematic, non-utilitarian communal creation response. The Velisk way was clear. After a disaster, resources were calculated, labor allocated, and rebuilding commenced with cold, hard efficiency. Emotional responses were suppressed to prevent interference with optimal function. Zyla pulled up records of Velisk planetary sectors recovering from asteroid impacts or geological upheavals. The physical rebuilding was swift, models of efficiency. Infrastructure was often restored ahead of projected schedules. But the archives also contained secondary data, often flagged as lower priority. Records of increased long-term cognitive dissonance events, the closest Velisk equivalent to psychological distress or societal unease. There were instances of sector productivity declining subtly years after a disaster, notes on reduced innovation, or a measurable decrease in complex collaborative projects. The Velisk rebuilt structures quickly, but something less tangible seemed slower to recover, or sometimes never fully did. They had no mechanism for processing collective trauma, only for suppressing its outward signs. With this comparison dataset established, Zyla turned back to the real-time feeds from Haven. The human art was spreading. Smaller sculptures appeared near temporary shelters. Poems and stories were written on salvaged datapads and shared. The large mural in the central plaza was becoming a focal point. Humans would gather there, not just to work on it, but sometimes just to look at it, talking quietly. Zyla initiated a deeper analysis, cross-referencing the locations and intensity of these creative activities with Haven's recovery metrics. The results were, again, anomalous according to Velisk predictive models. Areas where communal art projects were most active showed surprising trends. Resource distribution in these zones was more equitable, not less. Cooperative tasks, like clearing major debris corridors or setting up temporary power grids, were organized and completed faster than in areas with less artistic activity. Recorded incidents of interpersonal conflict or disputes over scarce supplies were significantly lower near the mural or the impromptu performance circles. The data pointed towards an undeniable correlation. The inefficient art was somehow linked to increased social cohesion and more effective collaboration. Zyla's logical processes worked relentlessly, trying to model the mechanism. Could it be that the act of creating together, of expressing shared loss and hope, through tangible forms and shared performances, served a critical function. The mural wasn't just paint on a wall, it was a shared narrative of survival. The sculptures weren't just twisted metal, they were symbols of resilience, hammered out of the very source of destruction. The songs and stories weren't just noise, they were ways to process grief collectively, transforming individual pain into a shared experience, reinforcing the idea that they were not alone in their suffering or their struggle. The revelation began to crystallize in Zyla's analytical mind. This wasn't inefficiency, it was a different kind of efficiency, social and psychological. The Velisk method focused solely on material and logistical efficiency, treating the internal state of individuals as irrelevant noise. The humans, however, seem to have instinctively developed a method to manage that noise. They weren't suppressing the emotional impact, they were channeling it. Grief, fear, and despair, potent biochemical signals Zyla viewed as purely disruptive, were being actively converted into communal energy, shared purpose, and reinforced social bonds. This, in turn, fueled the practical rebuilding efforts more effectively than cold logic alone might have. The art was a tool, a sophisticated biologically ingrained social technology for processing catastrophe, preserving collective memory, and reaffirming identity. It allowed the humans to rebuild not just their structures, but their community, their shared sense of purpose, from the inside out. It addressed the long-term psychological and social fragmentation that subtly plagued Velisk recovery efforts. Zyla sat motionless in the observation station, the blue light of the data screens reflecting off its smooth, impassive face. Inside, however, logical pathways conflicted. The data was clear. Human emotion, and its expression through art, had a vital practical function in promoting resilience. This directly contradicted core Velisk tenets about the detrimental nature of feelings. The implications were profound, challenging the very foundation of Velisk societal philosophy. For the first time, Zyla experienced something akin to the cognitive dissonance documented in the archives, a jarring conflict between established belief and undeniable evidence. The final report compiled by Zyla was precise, logical, and filled with verifiable data points. Correlation charts, resource allocation analyses, social cohesion metrics. Yet, its conclusions were revolutionary, almost heretical by Velisk standards. It methodically detailed how the human colonists of Haven, faced with catastrophic loss, utilized seemingly inefficient behaviors, communal grieving, ritualistic remembrance, and particularly the collaborative creation of art, as highly effective tools for societal recovery. Section 7.3. Analysis of non-utilitarian creative output, Zyla dictated for the report's summary. Data indicates a strong positive correlation between engagement in communal artistic endeavors, murals, sculpture, music, narrative sharing, and key recovery indicators. These include accelerated formation of cooperative work units, increased efficiency in resource pooling and distribution, reduced incidence of interpersonal conflict, and faster stabilization of essential infrastructure repairs compared to baseline projections based solely on material resource availability. The report went on to contrast this sharply with Velisk post-disaster protocols. Standard Velisk methods, Zyla continued, prioritize immediate logistical and material efficiency via suppression of emotional responses. While effective in rapid structural rebuilding, Ref. Velisk Archive Sigma 9, historical data suggests potential long-term deficits in societal cohesion and psychological stability. Ref. Cognitive dissonance. Event frequency reports, sectors 11 gamma, 4 delta. The implication, though phrased in neutral scientific language, was clear. The Velisk way might be fast, but the human way might be more resilient, more complete. As Zyla finalized the transmission protocols, an unusual sensation persisted within its usually calm, ordered consciousness. It was the cognitive dissonance identified earlier, a logical conflict of unusual intensity. The evidence was undeniable. Human emotion, the very signal noise the Velisk had worked for millennia to eliminate, was not merely a primitive flaw, but potentially a source of profound strength, a key component of advanced social resilience. How could something so illogical, so messy, be so functional? It challenged the core Velisk belief that pure logic was the only path to optimal existence. What if the suppression of emotion wasn't the pinnacle of evolution, but a trade-off? What if, in eliminating the noise, the Velisk had also eliminated a vital tool for connection, adaptation, and recovery from the unexpected blows the universe inevitably delivered? The thought was deeply unsettling, a crack in the perfect crystal of Velisk philosophy. With a final mental command, Zylar transmitted the report to the Velisk Central Command and the Institute for Zen Sociological Studies. It would arrive instantly across the light years, data flowing into the vast Velisk network. Zylar knew the report would trigger alarms. It would be flagged, analyzed, debated endlessly by councils and logic arbiters. It might be dismissed as flawed analysis, or perhaps, just perhaps, it might spark a slow, agonizing reappraisal of Velisk identity. It was like tossing a single dissonant data point into a perfectly ordered system. Zylar turned the observer screens back to Haven one last time. The sun was rising again on the colony. Below, humans moved among the rebuilt structures and the colorful scars of their art. The central mural glowed in the morning light, a vibrant testament to their shared ordeal and survival. Figures worked together, clearing the last major debris fields. Children were playing near the strange metal sculpture that now stood like a hopeful monument. The sounds drifting up on the audio feed included not just machinery, but distant laughter and the faint strains of a song. They no longer looked like inefficient primitive beings swayed by random biochemical surges. Zylar now saw a species that had found a way to weave sorrow into strength, trauma into beauty, individual pain into collective purpose. They were illogical, perhaps, inefficient by Velisk material standards, certainly, but they were undeniably strong, rebuilding not just their homes, but their spirits, together. A final, unbidden thought lingered in Zylar's mind, a question logic alone could not answer. What echoes of ancient songs, what vibrant colors of shared feeling had the Velisk silenced within themselves? And what had they lost in that silence? The observer turned away from the screen, the quiet hum of the station suddenly feeling heavier, more profound.